Peter Sutcliffe is one of the most infamous killers in British history. For 5 years he evaded capture while brutally murdering 13 young women across the north of England. It was an investigation with twists and turns and a case that still haunts the British public to this day.
For years, women and girls felt that simply leaving their homes at night meant taking their lives in their hands.
When Sutcliffe was eventually apprehended on January the 2nd, 1981, it brought an end to a manhunt that had both terrified and captivated the nation. The press had dubbed him the Yorkshire Ripper.
For women, it was a very frightening time, and they were stuck in this awful position of being told they shouldn't go out at night. It had an enormous social effect on the country.
As well as his 13 victims, Sutcliffe had attacked at least 7 more women. His arrest was a huge relief for the under-pressure detectives at West Yorkshire Police.
He attacked at random. We couldn't anticipate his moves. The whole of the north of England was held in a grip of terror, really, by this man. There was a sort of, I can only describe it as a Gothic-type cloud over the area.
But the Yorkshire Ripper's story begins over 70 years ago. Peter Sutcliffe was born on the 2nd of June 1946 in the market town of Bingley on the outskirts of Bradford, West Yorkshire.
He was the youngest of quite a large family. His brothers and sisters were all of strong character. They were all working class, could look after themselves. But Peter was a shy boy and very much attached to his mother.
His mother was somebody who was very much dominated and controlled by his father. So I think he had quite a lot of sympathy for his mum, and he thought the world of her as a child. But Peter was somebody who was quite shy, quite awkward, he was quite skinny and scrawny. And I don't think he ever lived up to his father's expectations. And I think that planted that seed of shame in Peter Sutcliffe that would come to shape the rest of his life.
Sutcliffe's awkward demeanour as a child manifested into a dysfunctional adulthood, demonstrated in his early career choices.
Peter Sutcliffe had a variety of different jobs throughout his life. He worked as a gravedigger for quite a period of time, and it was reported that he stole things from the corpses that he was burying. Now that suggests to me that he wasn't horrified or repulsed by dead bodies, and that's something that would be quite influential later on.
On Valentine's Day 1967, 21-year-old Sutcliffe met Sonia Shermer. The pair began a long-term relationship, eventually getting married in August 1974.
The relationship that he had with his wife, Sonia, appeared to have been a decent one, and I think he would have treated her fairly well because she served a purpose for him. Women like his mother and his wife, he saw as carers and nurturers, people who would look after him. Other women, I think he saw somewhat differently. I think Peter Sutcliffe's view of women is very black and white. They are either Madonnas or they are whores. So they're either these perfect domestic angels or they're these sinful creatures.
These opposing views on women collided with one another when a family revelation dramatically altered 23-year-old Sutcliffe's world. His mother, whom he'd looked up to as a child, had been unfaithful.
His mother had had an affair with a policeman, and his father had decided to confront his wife at a hotel where she was meeting this particular man, and took Peter with him.
Peter's father basically humiliated her and said, look, I know all about what's going on, and the children found out as well. So I think this kind of further cemented ideas as to what women were, what could be expected of them, always to be cautious and wary of them.
I think there was every possibility that after seeing his mother and seeing what happened, that possibly preyed on his mind and affected his attitude towards women.
Sutcliffe began to visit the red light districts of Yorkshire and find solace in prostitutes. But his feelings for these women would soon lead to violence and eventually murder. On the morning of October the 30th, 1975, just 12 miles away in the Chapeltown area of Leeds, the body of 28-year-old Wilma McCann was discovered in a local park.
Wilma McCann was a Scottish woman who had come down to Yorkshire. She was working as a prostitute. She was very hard up, and it was very difficult for her because she had young children, young family to support. And I think that was the only way she felt she could get enough money.
The attack on Wilma McCann set in motion what would become a clear pattern and regular method of ambush by the killer.
His modus operandi was to use a ball-peen hammer and was to strike them very hard and very fast on the back of the head so they fell unconscious. He used his hammer and hit her over the back of the head, and then he stabbed her 15 times in the neck, chest and abdomen.
But the police were no closer to catching the killer, and 3 months later, on the 20th of January 1976, another woman was murdered in Leeds. 42-year-old wife and mother Emily Jackson, who'd vanished after a night out at her local pub. Emily's son Neil was 17 years old at the time. He remembers receiving the tragic news on that fateful morning.
I've come downstairs. My dad's loading one of the vans up for work, and I'm getting my boots on ready for going to work and having a pot of tea, when they were knocking at the door and it opened the place. And that's when I first knew. And it was first knew when, like I said, for Dad, when the police knocked at the door. I can still remember it plain as day.
Again, a hammer had been used in the brutal attack. Emily had also been stabbed a total of 52 times with a screwdriver. Like Wilma McCann, Emily Jackson had been working as a prostitute to make ends meet.
It was just to help the family in dire straits, is what I've been told afterwards. When family were in hard times work-wise, she went elsewhere, but I didn't realise till well after.
This time, police were able to recover from the scene a key piece of evidence. On Emily's right thigh was a very firm and visible footprint from a size 7 Wellington boot.
For some inexplicable reason, he stamped on her thigh with such force that it left an imprint of the sole of his boot on her thigh. Now, police tried to trace that boot, or the manufacturers of the boot, which they did, and then try and find out people who had bought them, but it didn't come to anything.
Once again, the trail went cold. It was over a year until a murder with a familiar MO took place in Leeds. On the morning of February the 5th, 1977, the body of 28-year-old Irene Richardson was discovered. She'd been savagely murdered, another prostitute killed with a hammer. West Yorkshire police were suddenly dealing with a serial killer. What they didn't realise is that this was just the beginning of what would become one of the most infamous series of murders in British history. Less than 3 months after the death of a third victim, Irene Richardson, the killer struck again. On the night of the 23rd of April 1977, 32-year-old prostitute Patricia Atkinson became victim number 4. She was murdered in her own flat, this time not in Leeds, but in nearby Bradford.
She believed that if she invited customers into her flat, she was safe because all the killings had taken place in isolated parks or back alleys. So she thought she was safe, but she wasn't.
The killer hit Patricia 4 times around the head with a hammer and then mutilated her body with a knife. This time, detectives found a clue to link the murders of Patricia Atkinson and Emily Jackson.
The police found the same boot mark on the bedclothes at Patricia's house, Patricia's flat, as they found on Emily Jackson's thigh.
This crucial link confirmed the authorities' worst fears. The killer was expanding his hunting ground, and he seemed to have a favoured target. All 4 murder victims had been working as prostitutes. On the 17th of November 1980 in Leeds, Jacqueline Hill, a 20-year-old student, was hit over the head, stabbed repeatedly and mutilated. An attack that bore all the hallmarks of the Ripper. But Jacqueline Hill would be Peter Sutcliffe's final victim. Within 2 months, a routine police stop would lead to one of the most sensational arrests of modern times. The capture of the Yorkshire Ripper.
Just after New Year, on January 2nd, 1981, Peter went to Sheffield and picked up a prostitute. On the same evening, a policeman with a lot of years of service, decided to show a young rookie round Sheffield.
The two police officers spotted Sutcliffe's car near offices on Melbourne Avenue in Sheffield's red light district. They decided to approach and talk to the pair.
The cops asked, what's your girlfriend's name? He said, I don't know, we've only just met. And the policeman said, you know, I haven't just fallen off a Christmas tree. So he already realised there was something odd going on.
Peter said that he needed to urinate, and the officers let him go up to a wall by the side of the building. While he was away, the young police officer did a PNC check on the registration of the car and found that the plates were false. So Peter was arrested and taken to Dewsbury police station.
Once down at the station, Sutcliffe was searched. He wasn't carrying any weapons, but this time detectives weren't going to let him slip from their grasp.
So one of them thought, let's go back to that place where we spotted him and let's see if he did leave anything when he popped out of the car saying he was going to have a pee.
The police returned to the scene of the original arrest.
They found the hammer, the intended murder weapon, and they came back with them. And gradually after that, Peter Sutcliffe realised that the game was up, and eventually he confessed. And his only condition was that he be allowed to tell his wife, Sonia, before it became known to the general public that he was indeed the Yorkshire Ripper.
It had been over 5 years since the murder of Wilma McCann, but detectives finally had the Ripper in custody. It was a series of senseless killings that left the whole of France stunned. When 24-year-old Thierry Paulin was apprehended on the 1st of December 1987, he admitted to the murder of at least 21 helpless elderly women. In a series of killing sprees across 3 years, Paulin, a thief, left behind no witnesses at his crime scenes as he brutally strangled his victims to death. Detectives Jean-Claude Moulet and Claude Perroni had the task of bringing Paulin to justice.
Nous étions littéralement sous pression. La seule peur.
We were under immense pressure. The only thing we were afraid of was being on call. In other words, would a phone call wake us up that night? Headquarters calling us about a case, telling us about the killing of an old lady. We dreaded finding more victims every time.
On avait cette hantise de retrouver à chaque fois d'autres victimes.
Paulin n'est pas un tueur en série. C'est un tueur en chaîne. Le tueur en série est un tueur pathologique.
Paulin was not a serial killer. He was a spree killer. A serial killer is a pathological killer who kills to experience a physical or moral pleasure. In other words, he enjoys a terror he inspires in others. The spree killer is different. Paulin was a born criminal. In inverted commas, he was complete riffraff. Attacking a grandmother is a triumph without peril which brings no glory.
S'attaquer une grand-mère, hein? À vaincre sans péril, on triomphe sans gloire.
In a twist of fate, Paulin himself would be dead before the trial of his accomplice, Jean-Thierry Mathurin, in December 1991. Philippe Bilger was prosecuting.
Paulin escaped the trial. Unfortunately, it was AIDS that killed him, and of course we can lament the fact that the mastermind, the instigator, was never brought to justice. This much is clear. Forgive me for being crude, but the criminal justice system took what was left. In other words, Mathurin.
Mathurin was on trial for the murder of 8 women in just over 1 month during the autumn of 1984. The details of the slayings were shocking, even to Mathurin's defense lawyer, Michel Arnaud.
The photos and pictures were awful. It was difficult, very difficult. I must admit that when I studied the case files, I made sure that I didn't have lunch. I didn't have dinner. I couldn't.
The killings always followed the same horrific ritual.
Thierry Paulin les poussait dans l'appartement en leur tenant la bouche.
Thierry Paulin pushed them into the flat, holding their mouths. Jean-Thierry Mathurin closed the door, and from that moment on, Thierry Paulin hit them to get them to tell them where the money was. Jean-Thierry Mathurin went to look for electrical cables to tie them up, so Thierry Paulin could tie them up. He went to search the flat. If the victim revealed where the money was, Jean-Thierry Mathurin went to check if it was there. And in the meantime, Thierry Paulin became incensed and ended up strangling them.
S'acharnait et finissait par l'étrangler.
This killer's story begins over 50 years ago. Thierry Paulin was born in the former French colony of Martinique in the Caribbean on the 28th of November 1963. His teenage parents split up within days of his birth.
His father abandoned he and his mother pretty shortly after his birth and went to France. Thierry remained in Martinique and was effectively brought up by his paternal grandmother, who owned a restaurant and apparently neglected him. He made an attempt to go back to live with his mother, who by this point had remarried and had another family, but he didn't fit in incredibly well with that. In fact, he was a troubled young man.
This is a young lad who's being passed from pillar to post. He doesn't have a lot of stability, he doesn't have a lot of routine, and life is quite chaotic. He's somebody who finds that he never settles in anywhere, and he never really has a sense of belonging.
After moving to France, Paulin joined the army, but he was reportedly picked on for being of mixed race and a homosexual. In 1984, the 21-year-old moved to Paris.
When he left the army, he went to live with his mother, and he got a job at an entertainment venue that had a reputation for transvestite performers, and he joined in with this. I think this was the first time in his life when he really felt a sense of belonging. And Thierry was homosexual, and he developed a relationship with a man he met at this place.
Paulin's new lover was 19-year-old Jean-Thierry Mathurin. The like-minded couple had aspirations of performing on the stage, and they also shared a passion for dressing in drag.
I think if we look at his relationship, being homosexual in France at this time still carried quite a significant degree of social stigma. So even though he's found his place in the world, other people are still judging him, and I think that's something that is always going to trouble him.
The couple began living together in a hotel called the Laval. The flamboyant pair had become addicted to drugs and weren't living within their means.
It
was the world of nightlife. They were invited to all the big Parisian parties. There were transvestites, people who love to dress up, so they put on a real show.
Ils s'aimèrent profondément, il me semble. Mais
I think they really loved each other. I think there was real love there, but as part of that, Paulin dominated his partner, which explains a lot the influence Mathurin was under. He existed through Paulin.
L'influence que Mathurin a subie et qu'il a existé par Paulin lui-même.
Obviously, I didn't see them in their everyday lives. I didn't see them living together. I didn't see them laughing. I didn't see them in their most intimate moments. But I think it's clear that Paulin dominated Mathurin and gave him the drugs he needed. As so often in life, and that's also true for criminals, there was a strong one and a weak one in this couple. And the weak one was dragged into a life of crime by Paulin during these atrocities in 1984. That much is clear.
To pay for their lavish lifestyle, Paulin, with Mathurin in tow, turned to crime.
Each case, the motive was straightforward: money. Mathurin and Pauline wanted to have a good time. They wanted to go out, they wanted to party, they wanted to go to nightclubs, they wanted to indulge their appetite for drugs, they wanted to wear different clothes, they wanted to be acknowledged as homosexual, and They were intent on having as good a time as possible. It was a spree, without any doubt, and a spree of the most murderous kind.
We had two criminals under the influence of drugs who were completely remorseless and were looking for money, who laid waste to the scenes of their crimes, carrying out the worst kind of atrocities on these unfortunate old ladies.
The old women were coming back from either the post office or the market. They came back with food and bread, etc., and which was found scattered on the floor in the doorway.
It was child's play to push open the door and enter behind them, and then to subject them to mental and physical torture.
The attacks were shocking in their brutality. The killers ripped off their victims' clothes, burnt their feet, and even smashed a wine bottle over one lady's head. Another was suffocated with a mattress, and in the most extreme case, 84-year-old Alice Benaim was forced to drink cleaning fluid.
Something like drain cleaner, the main effect it has on the human body is that it is corrosive. So it will cause chemical burns to the mouth, tongue, the lips, and then if it's swallowed, it will cause chemical burns in the esophagus and the stomach, can potentially cause perforations. And if the fumes get into the lungs, they can set up a chemical reaction there, causing fluid on the lung and all sorts of potentially lethal consequences.
One victim was Alice Benaim. To tell them where her money was, Paulin and Mathurin forced her to drink a product used for unblocking sinks. You can only imagine the suffering to make her reveal where she had hidden her savings. One of them used to hide her savings inside her corset. She had pockets full of money. The way they made them talk was by twisting their fingers. It was to make them suffer.
Voilà, le moyen de les faire parler, c'était de leur tordre les doigts, c'était de les faire souffrir.
During this 2-month spree, the horrific murders sent shockwaves across the country, especially in the Montmartre district of Paris, where the majority of the crimes had taken place.
Je crois que ce qui a beaucoup frappé l'opinion publique, c'est...
I believe that what really struck public opinion was that the killer was targeting old, vulnerable, defenseless people. I believe that's what had the biggest impact on the public. There was no comparison between one murder and the next. It was the fact that these were defenseless people who were being killed.
Tuer des gens sans défense.
People were stunned, asking, why don't they arrest them?
The public wanted justice, but detectives were struggling to find any suspects.
And the longer it went on, the fewer facts we had, because everything had been tried to find them. All of the investigations had been done, from our perspective, but the luck factor was missing.
You have to see that with the atrocity and repetitiveness of their crimes, as well as the fact that there were no central police files at the time, that there was a general feeling that they wouldn't be arrested, and that created a real panic amongst the public.
We have no problem whatsoever with any of it. So it's just our house, and we made it a home, and we're pretty happy with it. You still get people walking by asking, how could we be crazy enough to buy this house and stuff. But between the two of us, we've made it into a home.
Yeah, and we tried to make it more comfortable and try to diffuse the whole mystique around it. And yeah, we were doing our best.
She was a hardened criminal in the body of a little old lady. Yeah, she was a hard person.
Pure evil.
Despite the renovations, John still remembers the home as the boarding house where 9 people lost their lives.
This is what I would call the death room. This is where Dorothea would bring her victims after giving them the drug and alcohol combination, and then bringing them in here and leaving them on the floor until she could prepare them at a later time. And when I pull the carpet back, the odor was so overwhelming, it was unbelievable. But I knew and recognized that smell. and it was the smell of putrefied body fluid that had seeped through the wooden floor from her victims, who had laid there for anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks, probably.
The day after finding the first body, Saturday, November the 12th, 1988, John vividly recalls the moment he realized the little old lady living at 1426 F Street was not what she seemed.
I looked up at one point onto that balcony, and Dorothea was standing there looking right straight down at me, knowing that probably within minutes I was going to uncover that second body, and sidetracked me from digging in order to walk her over to the motel. And it's there she made her escape.
Puente would remain a wanted fugitive for 5 days, but her story begins over 85 years ago. She was born Dorothea Gray in San Bernardino County, California, on January the 9th, 1929.
She was one of several children. She lost both of her parents quite early on. She spent time in an orphanage. She was kind of passed from pillar to post quite a lot, so she didn't form those stable, secure attachments with her caregivers that many of us do, and I think that went on to shape the person that she became.
Dorothea, lived a very difficult early childhood. She was deprived in substantial ways. She didn't have loving parents. She had to scavenge for food.
By the mid-1960s, Dorothea had been married 3 times and taken on the name of her third husband, Puente. She had already served time in prison for forging checks and had found a new way to earn money.
She starts to get involved in sex work, selling her body to basically put clothes on her back and feed herself. So she is living this quite kind of feral existence. Now, here's an individual for whom violence and abuse was just normal for her. If we look back at her childhood experiences, they're certainly not normal and warm and loving. They are quite brutal and quite cold. So this is the only thing that she knows. It's those basic emotions and those basic instincts.
And then, after becoming a prostitute, she discovered this occupation of being a caregiver, which requires minimal qualifications. And all of a sudden, a world was opened up to her.
In 1981, Puente began renting an apartment at 1426 F Street in downtown Sacramento. She took on the role of caretaker for the other tenants in the Victorian boarding house. Soon after, Puente met 61-year-old Ruth Monroe. Ruth's son, Bill Clausen, remembers his mother fondly.
She was great. I mean, she was my mom. I'm going to say she's great. But she was. She brought up 5 kids after my father passed away, and I thought she did a good job. We met Dorothea through a gentleman that my mom met while she was working, and he kept asking her out, and she finally went out with him, and then they started seeing each other, and he introduced her to Dorothea. During their friendship, Dorothea decided she wanted to open a restaurant, and my mom wasn't working anymore, and my mom had a little bit of money, so she ended up opening the little cafe at the Round Corner Bar.
Ruth ended up marrying Harold, the man who'd introduced her to Puente. But soon he was diagnosed with cancer and living full-time in a hospital. Ruth didn't want to live alone, and Puente had an idea. She could live with her at 1426 F Street. It turned out to be a fatal decision.
We moved her in there on Easter Sunday, 1982, and she died April 26th, 2 weeks later. I saw my mom every day from the time I moved her in there. I stopped by there on my way home from work. And the last 3 days of her life, she seemed like she was getting sick. And when I went there, I had noticed that she had a drink in her hand, and my mom didn't drink. So I asked her, I said, what's that? And she said, it was a drink that Dorothea fixed to calm her nerves. I said, fine, I didn't think anything of it because I knew they were friends, and okay, fine.
But Ruth deteriorated so badly over the next few days that the next time Bill went to visit her, she was almost catatonic.
Mom was laying there. I sat next to her and touched her and told her, I said, Dorothea's taking care of you, you'll be fine. And she had a tear coming out of her eye, and that was it. She didn't say anything. She just laid there. The next morning, I got a call from my brother telling me that mom was dead. Went over there. She had already been taken away by the coroner's wagon, and Dorothea had said that she committed suicide.
So immediately, I stopped. I yelled to my commander, "We have another one." And he runs over, and the first thing he asks is, "Where's Dorothea?"
It was a good question. Where was Dorothea Puente? A second body had been found buried in her yard, and she was nowhere to be seen. She wasn't at the hotel having a coffee. It had all been a ruse so that she could make an escape. Dorothea Puente was on the run. On Saturday, November the 12th, 1988, a police forensic team were digging up the yard of a boarding house in Sacramento, California. They had just unearthed a second body. Dorothea Puente, the 59-year-old landlady of 1426 F Street, had left the house and headed to a nearby hotel to have a coffee. But detectives were now very keen to speak with her.
I said I took her and watched her go to the coffee shop. She's supposedly over there at the hotel. So then another detective came and found out by speaking with the person at the counter in there that in fact Dorothea had come into the hotel, walked through the lobby, went to a payphone, picked up a payphone, and apparently called a taxi cab because the cab arrived and took off.
Puente had absconded, and detectives had no idea where she was headed.
And so at that time we called in the FBI and enlisted the help of other resources and outside agencies in trying to locate her, because that is what was key right now, is to try to find her as fast as we could.
Back at 1426 F Street, one of the many people who had gathered to watch the dig had given some important information to Deputy Coroner Laura Santos.
He told the story that he had dug holes in this yard for Dorothea, and she'd paid him cash, and then she just told him she was burying trash. So he came in and pointed out where he had dug holes.
Over the next 3 days, the excavation of the yard continued.
Just as we kept digging, we kept finding bodies and more bodies. And it just seemed endless. Whatever we took down, whatever we moved, wherever we were digging, we'd find a body. It was just unbelievable. She put 7 people in this small yard, and there wasn't even a witness to any of these burials. Not one.
The 7th and final body was found on Monday the 14th of November. It was buried right in front of the house, just feet from the sidewalk.
Well, she was kind of bundled up in almost like a scrunched up seated position, but she was missing her head, hands, and feet. I went through every flower pot and emptied them out to make sure that we weren't missing anything, but those appendages were never found.
To this day, we've never recovered the head, hands, or feet. Their whereabouts, it's anybody's guess. If the walls in this home could talk, we would probably be horrified.
3 days after the discovery of the 7th body, Thursday the 17th of November, Dorothea Puente was finally found. She had been spotted by a man in a bar almost 400 miles from Sacramento in Los Angeles.
He goes home And while he's watching TV, he sees her on TV as being wanted on the news. So he calls LAPD, gives the information. I was just having drinks with this person.
The man told the police which hotel Puente was staying in, and she was promptly arrested. John Cabrera immediately flew down to John Wayne Airport in nearby Santa Ana.
We landed, LAPD pulled up, out on the tarmac. We got out of the plane, and there she was. They had her in cuffs. You know, we ceremoniously walked over, and they transferred her to me. I asked her, you know, are you okay? Yeah, I'm okay. And then out of nowhere, she just says, Mr. Cabrera, I'm sorry.
The story of these two killers begins half a century ago. John Duffy was born in 1958 and David Mulcahy in 1959 on separate sides of the Irish Sea.
Well, both Duffy and Mulcahy are from Catholic families, Irish Catholic families. Duffy was actually born in the Republic of Ireland and came over to England with his family when his father was looking for work. Mulcahy was born in England, and he was the son of a man who went on to become a pub landlord.
In 1970, the two 11-year-old boys struck up a friendship while attending Haverstock School in North London.
I think that Duffy and Mulcahy came together for a variety of different reasons. They were both from Irish families, and the Irish community were still suffering quite a lot of discrimination at this point in time in British society. Also, there was a sense in which they could be a partnership, because Duffy, he was quite short, he had red hair, he was bullied at school, but Mulcahy was bigger, he was broader, and he could be his protector, essentially. So it was quite a brotherhood, really, rather than any kind of casual friendship, and it was them against the rest of the world.
By the age of 13, both boys were already displaying signs of disturbing behaviour.
Well, Mulcahy was suspended from school after he and Duffy were found essentially playing a version of cricket, but using a live hedgehog. And they were found after they'd been engaging in this, and Duffy was covered in blood, and he was laughing at Mulcahy, who was also covered in blood. So this really is quite a warning signal. It's basically a complete lack of empathy for the feelings of this living creature that they were tormenting. And they're starting to experiment here. Their behaviour is starting to escalate, and it really is quite a significant red flag.
They became fascinated with each other's company. They would haunt Hampstead Heath wearing Halloween masks and jump out and frighten courting couples who used to meet on Hampstead Heath, terrify them, and they took enormous pleasure from it.
So these two, they're really having the time of their lives doing this. They're really enjoying having that power over others, but I think to come across them out there in the park in the dark would have been really, really frightening.
As the two teenagers became young men, Duffy and Mulcahy's scare tactics took a criminal turn. The pair found work at Westminster City Council, Duffy as a carpenter and Mulcahy as a plumber. On one job, Mulcahy had spotted a woman who he thought needed to be taught a lesson. He and Duffy went to her house after dark, intent on raping the woman.
So Duffy and Mulcahy break into the house and lay in wait for the woman whose house Mulcahy's been decorating. But the woman, thankfully, doesn't come home that night. She's gone to a friend's. This infuriates both Duffy and Mulcahy.
So you've got a plan developing here. They're starting to actually decide, well, this is what we're going to do. This isn't something that's opportunistic. This is something that's very much premeditated.
Duffy and Mulcahy were undeterred. They tried the same plan again with a different woman, but escaped from her house when she returned home with a man.
And they probably talk about, say, look, the thing about breaking into people's houses and waiting for them is no good, because we don't know if they're gonna come back, we don't know if they're gonna come back with somebody else. So instead of that, how about we actually drive around, find someone, see someone on the street, and then we pounce on them, on a dark alley or something like that. So I think the rush that they got from breaking into the house just motivate them to go and do the real thing.
By 1980, both men were in their early 20s and married, but their lust for rape remained. 2 years later, they were ready to strike.
In October 1982, they found the first one. 21-year-old girl coming back from a party carrying a teddy bear. They put a knife to her throat and forced her into a garden of an empty house. They said, I think it was Duffy who said, "Don't worry, we only want the teddy bear." Nothing could have been further from the truth. They stripped the girl, gagged her, blindfolded her, and raped her.
From then on, the attacks became incredibly prolific. At one point, there was 3 in one night. They would generally drive around together, listening to music to psych themselves up. They carried with them a kit of balaclavas or masks. Mulcahy would put gaffer tape inside his jacket, which would then be used to gag the victims. He'd often blindfold them as well.
Paul Cheston from the Evening Standard newspaper recalls the fear felt across the capital.
That added to the sense of terror felt by Londoners that it was almost a military-style operation, and the planning that was going into it was much more than just spur of attack, moment attacks.
Mulcahy would always ask the victims their names and addresses as well, and would often steal items which had their address on, library cards, that sort of thing. The idea was that if these victims went to the police, we will find you, and so on. They always made sure their victims were reduced to a state of abject terror.
One such attack occurred in the summer of 1984.
The attack on the 2 Danish au pairs took place in July 1984. That night, Duffy and Mulcahy had been driving around for a long time, unable to find a victim. And finally, they saw these 2 18-year-old girls walking along Spaniards Road on the edge of Hampstead Heath. They'd been out in the West End and missed the last train home and were walking back. They decided to attack them both. Duffy had a replica gun, Mulcahy had a knife. They were dragged off the road and onto the heath and brutally assaulted.
No DNA evidence.
In February 1988, John Duffy's trial began at the Old Bailey in London.
John Duffy walked into the witness box at the Old Bailey and put up one of the worst offences ever heard by an Old Bailey jury, to suggest that he was suffering from amnesia and could remember nothing about what happened during the period in which he is accused of the murders and rapes, was frankly an insult to the intelligence of anyone in court, let alone the jury. His whole body language was of defiance. I am going to give you nothing. I am standing here sticking to my story and I don't care. And the piercing eyes that his victims spoke of, the wild staring blue eyes, absolutely radiated out from the witness box across the court.
Duffy was found guilty of 2 murders and 5 rapes. He was given 6 life sentences, but despite everything, he refused to give up the name of his accomplice and best friend.
Well, maybe the reason why Duffy kept quiet right at the beginning, they had the agreement that they had from a very young age, and they never broke that agreement. We're never going to rat on each other. So when he went to prison, he probably decided, I'm going to stay true because I am, a good friend, or I am the man I am, or whatever. I'm true to my word.
As Duffy's sentence began, David Mulcahy remained a free man. The married father of 4 set up his own decorating business, and life went on as normal.
I think Mulcahy is somebody who returns to a normal life and has absolutely no problem in doing that. And that's because he can switch. He can flip very easily because he doesn't feel empathy for his victims. He doesn't feel bad about what he's done. And it's very much about self-preservation for him.
Everybody knew that David Mulcahy was the second man, but he honestly thought that he got away with it. And for the next 10 years, he pretty much had.
But as Duffy's time in prison passed by, something inside of him clicked. After claiming to be suffering from amnesia, he suddenly got his memory back. By 1999, he was ready to talk and tell the police all about his accomplice, David Mulcahy. 11 years after his conviction, John Duffy was in prison serving 6 life sentences for his part in a series of rapes and murders in and around London between 1982 and 1986. But Duffy's partner in crime, David Mulcahy, remained free.
Mulcahy was the one who first suggested, let's break into the girl's house. He was the one who first suggested, let's go and find victims on the street. And he was the one who first suggested, let's commit murder. But the one who was paying all the price was Duffy. So it's very, very easy for you to see that after 10 years, you know, the little fuse from Duffy got to an end. And he was like, forget it, I'm gonna come and clean.
In 1997, Duffy, who had originally claimed to be suffering from amnesia about the crimes, had begun visiting a prison psychologist.
So basically, Duffy had been in prison for 10 years and thought this is an opportunity to talk and talk and talk. And basically, he told the psychologist about the offences that he had committed and the fact that he hadn't committed them alone.
During their conversations, Duffy reveals that he committed his crimes with another person, and she casually asks which prison his co-defendant is in, and Duffy drops the bombshell. He's not in prison, he was never caught. She says, I have to tell the police about this, which Duffy agrees to, and so she tells the police. John Duffy's just named his accomplice. It's someone called David Mulcahy.
It was a big breakthrough for detectives who'd been trying to bring Mulcahy to justice for over a decade. And a huge slice of fortune was about to initiate his downfall.
There's an extraordinary coincidence here. At the same time that this was going on, a similar series of attacks was taking place on Hampstead Heath, and police began to suspect that David Mulcahy may have become active again. They had a DNA profile for the attacker. Mulcahy was brought in, questioned, they took his DNA and it didn't match. And once again, he left the police station, very cocky, very arrogant.
But the police now had Mulcahy's DNA on file. They had to go back 15 years to find a match.
Amazingly, in deep storage was the clothing of the Danish au pairs raped on Hampstead Heath in 1984. And when the clothing was run through forensics, one sample of clothing had Duffy's DNA on it and the other had David Mulcahy's DNA. And suddenly, after all those years of thinking he got away with it, suddenly that case had come back to haunt him.
On February the 6th, 1999, David Mulcahy was taken into custody. He was one of Britain's most prolific serial killers. Over the course of 5 years, during the late 1970s and early 80s, he killed at least 12 men, confessing to as many as 15, the majority of whom have never been identified. Nilsen thought his crimes were simply being flushed from existence by dissecting the bodies piece by piece, boiling them, and then disposing of them down the toilet. But a routine drain inspection at his London home in 1983 would lead to his downfall.
We found a number of interesting items which can only be established once pathologists has examined it.
Are you satisfied that they are in fact human bodies?
This is a possibility, yes.
Dennis Andrew Nilsen was born on the 23rd of November 1945 in Fraserburgh, Scotland. He spent the early years of his life in this house. According to his mother, he was a quiet boy. Little, if anything, marked him out from the ordinary.
After his parents' marriage broke down, he spent the majority of his childhood living in the nearby village of Stricken.
His father was largely absent. He grew up with his mother and his siblings and his grandparents, and his family reformed and his mother remarried. So he had a lot of disruption, he had a lot of chaos. But lots of children have that.
He was isolated from an early age, and the isolation found solace in representations of people who weren't alive, like pictures in a storybook. He'd cut the picture out and take it home. That's what he liked, because that picture couldn't argue with him. It couldn't say no to him.
His mother has actually talked about the way that she would cuddle and have, physical warmth with her other children, but she felt repelled by Dennis. She was quite cold towards him. And this was even when he was just a little child. So right from the beginning, he's learning from his mum that he's different and that he's kind of repulsive in a way.
Due to the absence of his father and the distant relationship with his mother, Nilsen grew particularly close to his grandfather, who worked as a North Sea fisherman.
When he came back from sea, the grandfather would take him down to the beach, and they'd walk up and down the beach, and he'd tell him stories of what happened at sea. His grandfather was the one person he could relate to. This was the one tactile relationship he had, the only person who touched him.
But in 1951, Nilsen lost the one family member that he looked up to the most.
I firmly hold to this view that the death of his grandfather profoundly affected him.
His mother kind of skirted around the topic and said, your grandfather's just not very well and he'll be back. And then when the funeral came around and the body was laid out in the front room of the house, as it often is in these communities at this time, he kind of thought his grandfather was just asleep. So you've got this really traumatic event going on in his life, and he's really struggling to make sense of what's going on. And he's feeling pretty rejected, really, because he's got this really close relationship with his grandfather. One minute he's there and one minute he's not.
I'm utterly convinced that his idea of death and his idea of love were fused at that point. And after that, he could only love people who were dead.
On December the 29th, 1978, he met a 14-year-old boy called Stephen Holmes, and Nilsen knew there was only one way to guarantee his latest lover would never be able to leave him.
Stephen Holmes was a very young boy, and he was trying to get himself something to drink at a pub in Cricklewood. Nilsen offered to help out with the drink and then brought him back to his flat.
Stephen Holmes was never seen again. In a desperate attempt to stop him from leaving, Nilsen murdered the 14-year-old boy by strangling him with a tie before drowning him in a bucket of water. It was the beginning of a familiar pattern for Nilsen.
Essentially, he would frequent the gay pubs and gay bars and would meet men that he found attractive. He would meet men that he wanted to form relationships with, and they would go back to Nilsen's place.
His chosen victims, not necessarily all homosexual, but all vulnerable, I think you could say, or susceptible to somebody offering them a bit of comfort or a meal or a drink or whatever. But he obviously had a tendency to go for handsome young men or people who made themselves available to at least just hang out with him for a while.
But he didn't have the social skills to maintain a normal relationship at a normal pace in a way that wouldn't send people running for the hills. So the only way to keep people there was to kill them.
With Stephen, Nilsen initiated what would go on to become a familiar ritual for him.
The modus operandi of Dennis Nilsen was very similar for most of his victims. They would be plied with drink.
He would have a tie. By the time the victim was now drunk, almost comatose, going to sleep, he would put the tie round his neck and strangle him that way.
And if they were unconscious but not dead, then he would drown them in a bath or a bucket.
After that, he would get himself a drink, light a cigarette, and then spend the next few hours looking after the body.
He would get them out and he would sit and watch television with them. He would clean up the bodies.
He would clean it, dry it, dress it, put it comfortably in a chair. He would speak to the corpse in the chair. These were his pretend friends.
So what we've got going on here, there isn't like massive sexual depravity. What he was creating was a picture of domesticity. He would sit there and watch television with them. So he's killing for company, but in the most grotesque way.
It sounds in many ways like a very dark horror film, the way that he behaved. And I think that was part of the fascination with him, which exists to this day.
Dennis Nilsen's murderous career would continue undetected for 5 years.
I think one of the reasons Dennis Nilsen got away with it for so long was that even at that time, which is post the legalization of homosexuality. The disappearance of young men who were gay was not treated with the same amount of respect and energy as the police, I think, would treat it nowadays.
By February 1983, 37-year-old Nilsen had moved home and was living in a top-floor flat on Cranley Gardens in Muswell Hill, North London. After residents complained about the drains being blocked, a plumber was called in to investigate.
And they found what looked like bits of flesh. Nilsen suggested that it could be somebody had flushed their Kentucky Fried Chicken out or something like that, and that would be the explanation for little bones and flesh.
But the plumber wasn't so sure, and the following morning, February the 9th, 1983, he called the police. Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. remembers that day well.
My phone rang, and it was Peter Slade, the uniform inspector in charge that particular day. And he said to me, "Could you possibly come up here?" He said, "I've got a bit of a problem. I'm not sure what I've got, but I'd like you to see it." And he showed me a drain with an inspection plate cover open. And he pointed out that some bits of flesh had been hauled out of the drain at the bottom. So I said, well, let's have another haul around inside the drain, get anything else that's in there. And the scenes of crime officer that I had with me managed to pull out 3 or 4 pieces of flesh, each about 4 inches long, 1 inch wide, and 3 little bones with a knuckle at each end. And when I looked at them, I thought these bones had probably come from a human hand.
Peter took the remains to Charing Cross Hospital, where resident pathologist Professor David Bowen confirmed their suspicions.
He said it's human, and he said, by pure luck, you've brought me a piece of neck, off the neck, and your victim's been strangled. He said there's a clear ligature mark on this piece of flesh.
Most of us think of hair as being hair, but different parts of the body, the hair is quite different when you look at it down the microscope. And so the pathologist in the Nilsen case was identifying that this piece of skin had hair that fitted with being from someone's neck. So despite the difficulties of fragments of tissue being found in a situation like a drain, identifying the characteristic ligature mark on it, it's pointing you very strongly towards strangulation.
And I looked at him and I said, "You sure you've not been watching too much TV, Prof?" And he said, "No, it's as clear as a bell." He said, "This is human." So that only meant one thing to me, that somebody must have been murdered and flushed down the toilet.
Astounded, Peter drove back to Cranley Gardens and waited outside the flat all day until Nilsen returned home from work.
My first introductory words to him were, "I'm Detective Chief Inspector J from Hornsey Police Station. I've come about your drains." And he looked at me and he said, "Since when have police been interested in blocked drains?" I said, "Well, you take me up in your flat and I'll tell you." And you could smell immediately the decomposing flesh. I said to him, "Look, your drains were blocked with human remains." And he looked at me and he said, "Oh my God, how awful." And I just pushed my face a little bit nearer to his and said, "Don't mess about. Where's the rest of the body?" And he said, "Okay, it's in plastic bags in the front bedroom." Even at that point, his demeanour didn't change at all. He was just as he was when he came in the front door. He was okay. Maybe the game's up. And he was relaxed about it. So we walked him down to the car. I told him I was arresting him. So I drove the car back, and then Steve McCusker was obviously thinking to himself about all the body parts that were in so many different bags. And he popped the question to Nilsen, "Are we talking here about one body or 2? And Nilsen said neither. He said, "I think it's 15 or 16. And I can remember the steering wheel sort of shaking in my hands.
Junior played baseball at school, but he wasn't the star on the team. He was good at his schoolwork, but he wasn't the smart person in the class. He was just average. So there was nothing that stood out. There was nothing that said that this family would be the family that would produce a serial killer.
To the outside world, the Yateses were a happy, contented, all-American family.
In many ways, Yates's relationship with his father was completely normal. Usually it's thought that even one positive role model is sufficient to stop people from becoming seriously psychiatrically disturbed, and yet it didn't do anything here. We have to ask ourselves the question, why?
When investigators dug into Yates' family history, they discovered something shocking.
We learned that his grandmother killed his grandfather, and there was some violence in the family, obviously.
His grandmother didn't just kill his grandfather, but she killed him in a especially gruesome way. She took an axe to him, actually, and then was committed to a mental institution. And that becomes, I suspect, an intergenerational message, which is women are very dangerous. They have what you want, but they're very dangerous people.
While there was a violent history in the family, Yates himself allegedly suffered some trauma when he was just 6 years old.
We often find in serial killers that violence is actually rooted in shame. That shame is often something that has happened during the childhood, something that the child felt they had no control over, but something that they felt judged by, something that made them feel less worthy. Robert Lee Yates was sexually assaulted by another child who was a neighbour.
But Yates kept the assault a secret. The incident was never reported to police. After graduating high school, Yates met his first wife. In 1972, aged 20, Yates and his wife moved to the small town of Walla Walla in Washington state, where they enrolled in college. There he spent his free time alone in the woods, hunting, hiking, and fishing.
The parents of his wife, years later, say actually he was quite a loner. We never really got to know him. Even though he was married to their daughter, he was somebody who was quite insular, and it's that constant theme of invisibility.
Yates's marriage to his first wife ended in divorce just 18 months later. However, he had already begun a new relationship with another woman. In December that year, Yates got a job at the Washington State Penitentiary, and the first of their 5 children was born.
It wouldn't surprise me if he'd been fantasizing about this for quite some time. And he comes across 2 college graduates, and he decides that he's going to kill them. And that's what he does. He literally shoots them in cold blood.
A rage burst out. He acted entirely instinctively and shot them both. It is unimaginable. Why would you do that? There is something profoundly out of kilter in Yates's personality.
For Yates, simply murdering the young friends was not enough.
He placed the body of Susan on top of that of Patrick, and Susan's body, he'd removed a lot of her clothing. So this is really humiliating. This is really demeaning.
Yates left the bodies by the side of the creek and covered them with a pile of rubbish, a sleeping bag, and an old tire.
Yates essentially assassinates them. And what his motivation was is, it's anyone's guess.
Yates's flying career was quickly put on hold as his medical results were being processed.
He's grounded, he's not allowed to fly his helicopter. Now, this is a pivotal moment for me because somebody else has taken control, somebody else has made that decision. He's not the one that's in the driving seat anymore.
Despite not initially being able to fly, he remains in the National Guard. But with a large family to support, he takes on a menial job at a manufacturing plant in Spokane. And all the while, Yates continued to kill.
I think the murders that he committed were an attempt to get back control. I think there were things happening in his life that he felt were out of his control, and he wanted to feel powerful again.
His new hunting ground was the seedy strip in downtown Spokane, known as The Track.
Prostitutes to Yates were easy targets in that they would get into his vehicle without any questions asked. They would just decide upon what money was going to be exchanged for services. And the prostitutes were very vulnerable because most of them were drug addicts, and they'd sell themselves for money and use it to buy drugs.
Robert Lee Yates was very much a regular face on the sex workers scene in this part of town at the time. So he wouldn't just pick up women to have sex with, he would do drugs with them. He became part of their community. And I think he would be trusted by them. He was somebody that they knew.
In the summer of 1997, Yates picked up 20-year-old Heather from the downtown track to have sex with her.
But I suspect that the victims may not have known even the second before they died that this was going to be a killing, because I suspect their interaction went down much as an interaction with a prostitute goes down. And then when he was done, he draws his gun and he shoots.
Yates shot Heather in the head with a .22 caliber handgun.
Literally, there's just a second that the victim becomes aware that something's amiss, and after that, the victim is dead.
After Yates murdered Heather, he dumped her body on the side of the road.
Well, he was brazen in his thought as far as dumping the bodies.
In August that year, Yates was back on the track looking for easy prey. He picked up 16-year-old Jennifer. Like the young woman before her, her fate was a foregone conclusion.
Unlike money serial killers, the way that Yates kills is instrumental. He has sex with his victims, and then he pulls out a gun and he shoots them. They die virtually instantaneously at the hand of somebody who knows how to use weapons effectively. He's not trying to torture, he's not trying to terrorize, he's simply eliminating the witness.
He watches as the life literally drains from them. And this is an individual who's not going to stop because his offending is getting worse. It's becoming more sadistic.
Once dead, Yates prepared to move Jennifer's body, a ritual he would repeat time and time again.
After shooting them in the heads, he put bags over their head largely to keep his car clean. I mean, he didn't want the blood dripping out and would put plastic bags over their heads to keep the mess off his car.
10 days later, local farmers found Jennifer's badly decomposed body. It had been dumped in brush northeast of Spokane.
This site where Jennifer was found, it was next to a working farm near to an alfalfa field.
Investigators also found a number of bloodstains. When tested, they revealed DNA belonging to Jennifer.
They knew that her murder had been in that vehicle before she'd been dumped in a field northwest of Spokane.
All of the evidence is starting to match up, and it leads them right back to Robert Lee Yates.
The task force put in a warrant for Yates's arrest.
By the time the detectives get a warrant for his arrest, they were 100% certain they've got the right man.
On April the 17th of 2000, the task force put Yates under 24-hour surveillance.
The police had staked out the family home, made sure that he was there, and after he left for work at 6 o'clock the following morning, they moved in and they arrested him.
The same day, detectives searched Yates's house for further evidence. Immediately after his arrest, a sample of Yates's DNA was taken and compared with samples collected from a number of murder victims found between 1996 and 1998.
It was tested that day and came back late that afternoon. I recall that we were at the Yates home conducting a search when we got word that the DNA matched Robert Yates. At least 8 of the victims had the same DNA found on them, so we knew we were dealing with a serial killer. All investigators were very happy. We were actually elated.
The day after Yates was apprehended, a newspaper report was released detailing his arrest. Upon seeing it, former sex worker Christine Smith instantly recognized Yates as being the man who shot her in the back of his van in August of 1998. At the time of the incident, she thought she'd been stabbed and had reported it to police.
It wasn't until a couple of years later, when she was involved in a car wreck, that she went to the hospital and they discovered shrapnel in her head. And then she realizes that she's actually been shot. She hasn't been stabbed. Somebody has held a gun to her head and pulled the trigger. And not only that, This person who's done this is Robert Lee Yates, and she realises I could have been one of his victims.
Christine's evidence helped connect the final pieces of the puzzle.
Her coming forward was very crucial to the task force. She came forward, provided the information to law enforcement, and she was a living victim, if you will. It's a living person that could testify against Robert Yates.
A month later, in May of 2000, investigators meticulously searched Yates's black van. They discovered blood pertaining to 2 other victims, 3 bullet holes, and spent bullets and bullet debris containing Christine's DNA.
When the task force finally got to her, they had the bullet fragment surgically removed, and it ballistically matched up to the same weapon that was used in some of these other killings.
While searching Yates's property, investigators discovered the murder weapons.
He used handguns. Some of the victims may also have been killed with a .22, but most of the murders were committed by a .25 caliber handgun.
The task force now had enough evidence to charge him with a total of 13 murders and the attempted murder of Christine Smith. In October of 2000 at the Spokane Superior Court, Yates faced his charges. In front of a packed room, the serial killer took to the stand and made a shock plea.
Yates, to the surprise of many, goes to court and pleads guilty to 13 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder.
The callous killer avoided going to trial by pleading guilty to the murders.